Well, the international community is grappling with how to respond to Sunday's protests in Cuba. U.S. President Joe Biden expressing support for the protesters on Monday, calling their demonstration a, quote, clarion call for social justice, even as some in the international community are pressuring him to reverse Trump-era sanctions on the island. Sunday's events prompted waves of support as well as counter-protests across the southern United States, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. This as Cuba recorded its highest single-day tally of COVID infections over the weekend. Cuba was hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic as tourism and access to imports dropped off drastically. Joining me now to unpack all of this is economist and Cuba scholar Fernando Menendez. Fernando, thanks so much for joining us. We know that many people in Cuba have been frustrated politically for years, but that aside, it seems that these protests were triggered now, at least immediately, by economic situations. To talk a little bit about the country's current economic struggles and what's been causing the challenges.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. For the past 60 years, the economic system has been fundamentally fraught with all sorts of problems and issues, and has not been able to deliver to the Cuban people. Most currently, the economy is contracted by 11% last year. Tourism, as you pointed out, has crashed during the pandemic, and remittances are not coming in due to some of the Trump regulations. And as far as things like sugarcane harvest, they've had a terrible sugarcane harvest in the last year. This has depleted their foreign reserves. It's depleted their ability to buy all sorts of things. And what has happened is a number of shortages. Shortages in food, shortages in fuel, which have led to recurring blackouts throughout the island. They even have a shortage of syringes, which makes the use of vaccines, which they have produced, almost impossible to get out. But fundamentally, there is a shortage of hope on the island, especially among the young, and anyone who is looking for an avenue for change or an alternative.
You mentioned some of the remittances there. I know that under the Trump-era sanctions, which added on to U.S. sanctions, Western Union was forced to shut its locations on the island, and that's really had an impact on Cubans relying on remittances from abroad, and that's had impact on the currency. How is that pinch being felt in a place where there's this dual currency as well?
There's a tremendous surge of inflation currently on the island. Essentially what you have is people are going into stores, they are waiting in lines outside of stores for hours, for 6 hours sometimes, and then you get to the end of the store and there's nothing in the store itself. So this is one of the trigger points that has led to some of these protests. Not to mention the fact that Cubans are dying of COVID. While the government exports doctors and vaccines to other countries to boast of its superlative medical system, as they claim, there are Cubans dying in the halls in hospitals. There are no ventilators. There's very little in terms of medicine available. Their caseload in terms of COVID is almost 7 times the U.S. average on a per capita basis.
We should know that Cuba is developing 5 homemade vaccines, one of which I believe was just approved, and obviously struggling like many other countries with COVID. I wanted to ask you, this is happening at a time where there is no Castro in power, neither of the brothers. How does that change the equation?
I think that's a fantastic question. What you're looking at is a revolution that is running out of fuel. If Fidel Castro or Raul at one time could be said to have motivated or to somehow commanded some sort of respect, the new leadership does not have that sort of history. It doesn't have that background. It doesn't motivate. The new leadership is at a loss in many respects. And younger Cubans, what you're seeing on the streets is that younger Cubans want nothing from their government. What they want is the freedom to lead their own lives, whether it's politically, economically, or socially. That's what they're asking for. The new leadership doesn't seem to have answers for those questions.
We saw the images of President Diaz-Canel going out to the streets, and I guess it was meant to send the same image of Castro doing it when he did it. I just don't know if it had that same effect. But I will say that the Castros tried to privatize parts of the economy over the last, in their final years. Did that help? Did that go far enough?
Not particularly. The economy, you would have to say the economy is still state controlled. What there is of private initiative is very heavily regulated, very heavily taxed, and limited to certain areas and certain activities. So you can't really generate the kind of capital necessary to create jobs and incomes that are worth anything. The average Cuban is still earning something in the range of $20 a month. That's abysmal by any standard.
No doubt many people in the U.S., including southern parts of the U.S., closely watching what's happening on the island. Fernando Menendez, thank you for joining us.